The most devastating threat to the German Empire did not come from rival nations, but from a clandestine homosexual circle operating within the Kaiser's own court. At its center was Philipp zu Eulenburg, the emperor's closest confidant, who led a powerful secret brotherhood bound by same-sex attraction and political ambition. Their hidden lives eventually sparked a catastrophic scandal, one that dictated imperial policies, shook the foundations of Europe, and became the ultimate royal shame of Queen Victoria's lineage. Born in 1847 in Königsberg, Philipp zu Eulenburg's unparalleled influence was rooted in a sharp divergence from his peers. As a product of the highest echelons of the Prussian Junker class, his family lineage was deeply entrenched in the traditions of the state, expected to produce austere military officers and stoic government officials. However, from a young age, Eulenburg demonstrated an acute divergence from the typical Prussian aristocratic mold. While his contemporaries embraced the harsh realities of the parade ground and the hunting lodge, Eulenburg possessed a deeply sensitive artistic temperament. He was a gifted composer, a poet, a skilled architect, and an exceptional conversationalist. In a society that routinely dismissed the arts as frivolous or unmanly, Eulenburg utilized his cultural refinement not as an escape, but as an unconventional weapon of diplomacy. His early career reflected this dichotomy. He dutifully served in the Gardes du Corps, an elite Prussian cavalry regiment, and saw active combat during the Austro-Prussian War and the Franco-Prussian War. He earned the Iron Cross, proving his physical courage and fulfilling his aristocratic obligations. But the brutality of warfare left a lasting mark on him, cementing a lifelong aversion to military aggression. Following the wars, he transitioned into the diplomatic service, a sphere where his natural charm, linguistic skills, and profound emotional intelligence could be weaponized. It was within this diplomatic framework that Eulenburg began to cultivate a vast network of connections across Europe's royal courts. He understood fundamentally that European politics at the close of the 19th century was less about abstract statecraft and more about the deeply personal, often volatile, relationships between a handful of monarchs. The turning point in European history and the genesis of Eulenburg's unparalleled rise occurred in 1886 when he forged a bond with Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, the man who would shortly become Kaiser Wilhelm II. The dynamic between these two men was complex, rooted in profound psychological needs rather than mere political alliance. Wilhelm was a man burdened by immense historical expectations and severe personal trauma. As the eldest grandchild of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, he carried the heavy legacy of the British royal network. However, his birth had been extraordinarily difficult, resulting in Erb's palsy, which left his left arm withered and largely paralyzed. In the hypermasculine, perfection-obsessed culture of the Prussian court, this physical disability was viewed as a catastrophic flaw. Wilhelm's mother, Princess Victoria, an intellectual and liberal Englishwoman who despised the authoritarian Prussian system, treated her son's disability as a personal failure. She subjected him to grueling, often barbaric medical treatments in a desperate attempt to fix him. This relentless pressure and fundamental lack of maternal affection left Wilhelm deeply insecure, highly erratic, and desperate for validation. He compensated for his physical limitations with bombastic rhetoric, an obsession with military uniforms, and a facade of aggressive, uncompromising strength. Beneath this blustering exterior, however, the future emperor was fundamentally fragile, requiring constant reassurance and a stabilizing presence. Philipp zu Eulenburg provided exactly what Wilhelm lacked. 12 years Wilhelm Sr., Eulenburg stepped into the role of a surrogate father figure, a soothing counselor, and an absolute loyalist. When Wilhelm was prone to hysterical outbursts or deep depressions, Eulenburg was the only courtier who could pacify him. He did not lecture Wilhelm as Bismarck did, nor did he judge him as his mother did. Instead, Eulenburg engaged Wilhelm through the arts, singing his own compositions, reciting poetry, and creating a private sanctuary away from the crushing demands of statecraft. Eulenburg recognized the emperor's psychological fractures and skillfully positioned himself as the essential mortar holding Wilhelm's volatile personality together. This deep emotional dependence granted Eulenburg a level of access that baffled and infuriated traditional politicians. When Wilhelm ascended to the throne in 1888, following the tragic, brief reign of his father, the political landscape of Germany shifted seismically. The young Kaiser, eager to assert his own authority, quickly grew intolerant of the aging Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck had designed a complex, delicate system of European alliances, but Wilhelm, driven by a desire for personal glory, found Bismarck's cautious realpolitik suffocating. In 1890, Wilhelm forced Bismarck's resignation, an event that shocked the world and created a massive power vacuum at the center of the German Empire. It was in this vacuum that Eulenburg's invisible authority became institutionalized. He explicitly declined formal executive positions, recognizing that a man in the shadows wields power without attracting the direct fire of parliament or the press. Instead, he operated as the ultimate gatekeeper. He served formally as the Prussian ambassador to various courts, most notably in Vienna, but his primary residence remained by the Kaiser's side. If a minister wished to propose a law, if a general sought a promotion, or if a diplomat needed to present a treaty, the path to the Kaiser's signature inevitably ran through Eulenburg. He carefully curated the personnel surrounding the emperor, aggressively promoting men who shared his own conservative yet anti-militaristic viewpoints, and ruthlessly marginalizing those who threatened his monopoly on the Kaiser's attention. Eulenburg effectively became the casting director of the German government. He was instrumental in the appointment of Bernhard von Bülow to the chancellorship in 1900, calculating that Bülow, a polished and pliable diplomat, would serve as an effective buffer between the erratic emperor and the Reichstag, while remaining entirely dependent on Eulenburg's patronage. This system allowed Eulenburg to steer German foreign policy away from direct military confrontation, favoring a strategy of diplomatic maneuvering and cultural influence. He was deeply aware of Germany's precarious geographic position in the center of Europe and understood that a two-front war would mean the annihilation of the empire. Therefore, he continually used his calming influence over Wilhelm to diffuse international crises, talking the emperor down from his frequent militaristic blusters and preventing the hawkish elements of the Prussian general staff from pushing the nation into premature conflicts. Yet, this shadow government was inherently unstable. It relied entirely on the emotional stability of an unstable emperor and the continued secrecy of Eulenburg's own private life. The political structure Eulenburg had built was a gilded cage, isolating the Kaiser from the harsh realities of governance and surrounding him with a sycophantic court that insulated him from legitimate political criticism. The public and the press were completely blind to the fact that the destiny of millions was being heavily influenced by intimate conversations held in private drawing rooms and hunting lodges, far removed from any democratic oversight. The entire foundation of the German Empire's leadership rested precariously on the bond between these two men, a bond that was about to be scrutinized by a rapidly modernizing society that was growing increasingly suspicious of unchecked aristocratic privilege. To consolidate his influence over the emperor and construct a durable political network, Philipp zu Eulenburg required a physical sanctuary. He needed a space entirely insulated from the rigid protocols of the Berlin court, the prying eyes of the parliament, and the hostile gaze of traditional Prussian militarists. He found this sanctuary at his ancestral country estate, Schloss Liebenberg, located in the dense forests of the Mark Brandenburg, just north of Berlin. Liebenberg was not merely a country house. It functioned as the shadow capital of the German Empire. It was here, amidst the sprawling hunting grounds and opulent drawing rooms, that Eulenburg curated an exclusive gathering of the nation's most powerful figures, a group that history would later identify as the Liebenberg Circle. To the outside world, the gatherings at Schloss Liebenberg presented a flawless facade of aristocratic leisure and conservative power. The guest list was a closely guarded testament to Eulenburg's supreme status. It routinely included the highest-ranking generals of the Imperial Army, influential cabinet ministers, senior diplomats, and cultural luminaries. Officially, these men convened to partake in the traditional pursuits of the Prussian elite. They engaged in extensive hunting expeditions, discussed classical art, listened to Eulenburg's musical compositions, and debated the geopolitical trajectory of the empire. The atmosphere was designed to be culturally refined yet unmistakably powerful. The crown jewel of these gatherings was the frequent presence of Kaiser Wilhelm II himself. When the imperial train arrived at the local station, the grueling, hyper-formal atmosphere of Berlin was immediately suspended. At Liebenberg, Wilhelm was not required to wear the psychological armor of the warlord. He shed the heavy, metal-laden uniforms and the aggressive public persona he adopted to mask his insecurities. Here, surrounded by Eulenburg's carefully selected cadre, the emperor was addressed by affectionate nicknames. He engaged in parlor games, listened to poetry, and sought refuge from the crushing administrative burdens of the state. Eulenburg orchestrated this environment with total precision, ensuring that Liebenberg remained the one place on earth where the most powerful man in Europe felt entirely safe, understood, and unchallenged. However, beneath the surface of these aristocratic retreats operated a highly compartmentalized and deeply concealed reality. The Liebenberg Circle was not merely a political alliance or a gathering of like-minded conservatives. At its core, it was an intimate network defined by a shared clandestine lifestyle. Extensive historical analysis of private diaries, heavily coded letters, and later police testimonies reveals that the inner core of this group functioned as a homosexual underground. This clandestine arrangement carried lethal risks. Under paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code, sexual acts between men were strictly outlawed and carried severe penalties, including years of hard labor and the total irreversible destruction of a man's social and professional standing. In the hypermasculine environment of the Prussian military and aristocracy, the mere accusation of such behavior was a death sentence for one's career and honor, frequently ending in forced resignation or socially mandated suicide. Yet, the men at the center of the Liebenberg Circle, the very men responsible for administrating and enforcing the laws of the German Empire, were routinely violating paragraph 175. This inner circle included highly visible figures such as Count Kuno von Moltke, the military commander of the city of Berlin, and a personal aide-de-camp to the Kaiser. Another prominent member was Count Emil von Schlitz, a wealthy aristocrat and director of the Royal Theatre. Within the protective walls of Liebenberg, and through their extensive private correspondence, these men cultivated a distinct subculture. They utilized a complex system of codes to communicate, referring to their shared orientation with oblique terminology. They adopted feminine nicknames for one another. Eulenburg was often Fili, Moltke was Tutu. They formed intense romantic friendships that frequently crossed the line into sexual intimacy, exchanging partners and providing mutual emotional support in a society that demanded they suppress their true nature. This was not simply a matter of shared secrets. It was a complex system of mutual survival and state-sponsored protection. The members of the Liebenberg Circle weaponized their immense political and military authority to construct an impenetrable shield around their private lives. Because they controlled the levers of state power, they controlled the mechanisms of investigation. If a low-ranking police informant caught wind of an indiscretion involving a member of the circle, the report would inevitably land on the desk of a senior official who was either a member of the group or heavily reliant on Eulenburg's political patronage. The investigation would be quietly terminated, the informant silenced or reassigned, and the file destroyed. They also leveraged the archaic Prussian code of honor to their advantage. In their social stratum, challenging an accuser to a duel was the standard method of resolving disputes regarding personal reputation. Any journalist or political rival who dared to whisper about the true nature of the Eulenburg circle knew they would immediately face a challenge to a pistol duel from an elite military officer. This threat of lethal physical violence, combined with their absolute control over the state's investigative apparatus, created a chilling effect that kept the press and political opponents at bay for nearly 2 decades. The system effectively protected itself, allowing these men to govern the empire while living a double life of extraordinary risk. This intense personal cohesion directly translated into a formidable political bloc. Because their survival depended on mutual trust and absolute loyalty to Eulenburg, the members of the circle acted with total unity in matters of state. They functioned as a powerful, moderating force against the aggressive, hawkish factions within the military and the government. While men like Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz relentlessly pushed for massive naval expansion to challenge the British Empire, a policy that inevitably risked global conflict, Eulenburg and his allies utilized their access to the Kaiser to advocate for diplomacy, strategic alliances, and the avoidance of direct confrontation. Their private solidarity made them the most effective political machine in Germany, capable of quietly dismantling the plans of the most decorated generals simply by having the last intimate word in the Kaiser's ear. However, the architecture of this secret network contained a fatal structural flaw. The protection mechanism of the Eulenburg circle was entirely dependent on maintaining the facade of aristocratic exclusivity. As long as their intimate affairs were confined strictly to men of their own social standing, dukes, counts, and high-ranking officers who had equal reason to maintain absolute silence, the secret remained secure within the vault of the upper class. The circle provided a closed loop of complicity, but Philipp zu Eulenburg's own desires did not remain within the safe, insulated confines of the Eulenburg estate or the high aristocracy. While he maintained intense emotional and romantic bonds with his peers, his physical appetites drove him toward a vastly different, far more dangerous demographic. It was a compulsion that required him to step outside the impenetrable fortress he had built, crossing rigid class lines and exposing himself to individuals who were not bound by the aristocratic code of honor, who did not fear the threat of a duel, and who could not be easily controlled by the mechanisms of the imperial state. This reckless divergence from the protective norms of his own secret circle would ultimately set the stage for the collapse of his entire world. The architectural perfection of the Eulenburg circle lay in its symmetry. It was an elite sanctuary built for the elite, protected by the very men who populated it. As long as the illicit affairs remained contained within the velvet-lined walls of the high aristocracy, the secret was impregnable. An imperial count had just as much to lose as a prince. Mutually assured destruction guaranteed absolute silence. But human desire rarely adheres to the logical boundaries of political survival. While Philipp zu Eulenburg valued his peers for intellectual companionship and emotional solidarity, his physical compulsions drove him far outside the gilded cage he had so meticulously constructed. He harbored a deeply ingrained preference for what would later be termed rough trade, a sexual attraction not to his equals, but to men situated at the absolute bottom of the rigid German social hierarchy. In the rigidly stratified Wilhelmine Germany, crossing class lines for physical intimacy was not merely a moral failing, but an act of profound social subversion. The division between the landowning Junker aristocracy and the working poor was a chasm of wealth, education, and legal privilege. For a man of Eulenburg's staggering status, a prince of the empire, an ambassador, the Kaiser's closest confidant, to cross this chasm for physical intimacy was considered not merely a moral failing, but an act of social subversion. It was an aesthetic and physical rejection of his own class in favor of the grit and desperation of the streets. Eulenburg's pursuits were highly specific and ruthlessly transactional. He did not seek romance or mutual understanding with these men. He sought the stark contrast of power. His primary hunting grounds were not the grand ballrooms of Berlin, but the rural waterways of Bavaria, specifically Lake Starnberg. During his diplomatic postings in Munich, Eulenburg would frequently retreat to the lake, hiring simple wooden rowboats to navigate the waters. Here, he sought out the local boatmen and fishermen. These were men of severe poverty, weathered by hard labor, living hand-to-mouth in a rapidly industrializing nation that had left them behind. When a prince of the realm approached a rural boatman, there was no possibility of equal consent. The dynamic was defined by a crushing imbalance of authority and capital. Eulenburg utilized his immense personal wealth to purchase their compliance. What began as an excessive tip for a boat ride would quickly escalate into direct payments for sexual services. For a man struggling to feed his family on a fisherman's meager earnings, the sudden influx of aristocratic gold was impossible to refuse. Eulenburg bought their bodies, and subsequently, he bought their silence. He maintained a meticulous, highly dangerous ledger of these transactions, dispensing regular charitable allowances to these men for years after the initial encounters, effectively placing them on an illicit payroll designed entirely to protect his reputation. Yet, the boatmen of Starnberg were only one facet of a broader pattern of exploitation. In the urban centers of Berlin and Munich, Eulenburg targeted men whose occupations rendered them invisible but omnipresent. Police records that would later be unearthed revealed a history of encounters with milk deliverymen, street sweepers, and day laborers. These men were invited into the private, opulent apartments of the prince, creating a jarring collision of worlds. The working-class men were briefly elevated into a realm of unimaginable luxury, utilized, paid off, and immediately returned to the obscurity of the lower-class slums. The most dangerous manifestation of Eulenburg's compulsions, however, involved the military. The Imperial German Army was the sacred institution of the state, the physical embodiment of Prussian honor. Its soldiers were heavily indoctrinated with notions of duty, discipline, and uncompromising masculinity. To tamper with the military was to tamper with the soul of the empire itself. Yet, Eulenburg actively targeted lower-ranking soldiers, particularly privates and non-commissioned officers from regiments stationed near his residences. This specific choice of partner highlighted the profound contradictions of Eulenburg's life. By day, he advised the supreme warlord of the German Empire, shaping the policies that commanded these very troops. By night, he stripped these soldiers of their uniform and their dignity, reducing the proud symbols of Prussian militarism to paid instruments of his own gratification. When a general approached a private, the soldier was trained to obey without question. When the Kaiser's best friend, a man whose influence could make or break a regiment's commander, made an advance on a low-ranking guardsman, refusal was effectively an act of insubordination. The soldiers knew instinctively that complaining to a superior officer about the prince's behavior would likely result in their own court-martial, not his arrest. Eulenburg leveraged this institutional fear to his advantage, transforming the rigid hierarchy of the army into a mechanism for his own protection. But in doing so, he engaged in a profound form of class exploitation. These young men, often drafted from poor rural farming communities, were thrust into a highly compromising, illegal situation by one of the most powerful men in the country. If discovered, paragraph 175 of the Criminal Code would be applied to them without mercy. They would face military prison, dishonorable discharge, and social ruin. Eulenburg, insulated by his wealth and his proximity to the throne, operated under the assumption of his own untouchability. The risk was almost entirely borne by the impoverished men he consumed. This behavior represented the fatal structural flaw in the shadow government he had built. Aristocrats in the Liebenberg circle understood the absolute necessity of discretion because their own survival depended on it. A duke or a count knew how to navigate the unwritten rules of high society, how to speak in codes, and how to maintain a flawless public exterior. The working-class men Eulenburg patronized possessed no such training, nor did they have the same incentives to protect the imperial establishment. A boatman with a sudden, unexplained surplus of cash in a local tavern is prone to boasting. A soldier, resentful of the abuse of authority, or perhaps simply looking to leverage his secret for more money, might complain to a comrade or a sympathetic local policeman. The payments Eulenburg made to keep these men quiet were not a guarantee of silence. They were a slowly accumulating paper trail of hush money, a financial record of his crimes circulating through the lowest, most uncontrollable echelons of German society. By venturing outside his protected aristocratic sphere, Eulenburg handed the keys to his destruction to the very people his government oppressed. The whispers began not in the halls of Parliament, but in the muddy alleys of Munich, the rural taverns of Bavaria, and the crowded, unglamorous barracks of the infantry. These rumors slowly filtered upward, reaching the ears of low-level police inspectors who, unlike their aristocratic superiors, had no vested interest in protecting the Kaiser's confidant. They began quietly collecting statements, taking note of the strange financial relationships between a prince and the fishermen of Starnberg. For nearly 2 decades, Eulenburg managed to outrun these rumors, utilizing his network to quash minor police inquiries and intimidate low-level blackmailers. He operated under the fatal illusion that his wealth and his connection to Wilhelm II could indefinitely suppress the truth. He failed to realize that he had built a mountain of combustible material in the darkest corners of the empire. He had compromised dozens of vulnerable men, creating a vast, unstable network of witnesses who owed him no true loyalty. All it would take was a single, coordinated spark from someone outside the control of the Liebenberg circle to ignite this material and blow his carefully constructed shadow empire to pieces. That spark was currently being prepared by a man who despised the aristocratic establishment, a man armed not with a dueling pistol, but with a printing press. The year 1906 represented the zenith of Philipp zu Eulenburg's invisible empire. From the manicured grounds of Schloss Liebenberg, he had successfully engineered the appointment of his chosen candidate, Bernhard von Bülow, as chancellor. He had navigated Kaiser Wilhelm II through numerous diplomatic minefields, maintaining a delicate, albeit tense, peace across the European continent. To the casual observer of Imperial German politics, Eulenburg's position was unassailable, his protective network impenetrable. Yet, the very geopolitical strategies he championed were enraging a powerful faction of German nationalists who viewed his diplomatic caution not as wisdom, but as an emasculating weakness. This ideological fury found its ultimate weapon in the hands of a man who existed entirely outside the aristocratic establishment. A man who understood that to destroy Eulenburg's policies, he had to destroy Eulenburg the man. That man was Maximilian Harden. Maximilian Harden was the antithesis of everything the Liebenberg circle represented. Born Felix Ernst Witkowski to a Jewish merchant family in Berlin, he had converted to Protestantism, changed his name, and fiercely assimilated into the intellectual vanguard of German nationalism. He was not a prince, he held no military rank, and he was explicitly barred from the elite social circles that governed the empire. However, Harden possessed an instrument of power that the aristocrats fundamentally underestimated: a devastatingly effective independent printing press. In 1892, Harden founded the weekly political journal Die Zukunft, meaning the future. Through brilliant, often vitriolic prose, Harden built Die Zukunft into the most feared and widely read political publication in Germany. He was a populist intellectual, a crusader who saw himself as the true guardian of the German spirit. Viewing the aristocratic elite with profound suspicion, Harden's political philosophy was anchored in the legacy of Otto von Bismarck. He worshipped the blood and iron Realpolitik that had unified Germany, and he was deeply disturbed by what he perceived as the softening of the empire under Wilhelm II. For years, Harden had watched with growing alarm as Germany backed down from international confrontations, most notably during the First Moroccan Crisis of 1905, where the German Empire was diplomatically humiliated by France and Britain. Harden needed a scapegoat for this perceived national weakness. He refused to blame the German military, and he could not directly attack the Kaiser without facing immediate imprisonment for lèse-majesté. His crosshairs, therefore, settled permanently on the invisible wall surrounding the throne, the group he publicly christened the Eulenburg Camarilla. Harden became convinced that the German Empire's foreign policy was failing because it was being dictated by a cabal of men who lacked traditional masculine resolve. Through his vast network of informants, which included disgruntled former chancellors, sidelined military officers, and low-level police officials, Harden began to gather intelligence on the private lives of Eulenburg and his associates. What he discovered gave him the ultimate ammunition. He realized that the rumors of the homosexual underground at Schloss Liebenberg, and more importantly, Eulenburg's highly illicit transactions with working-class men and soldiers, were not merely gossip. They were verifiable facts backed by police records that the state was desperately suppressing. Harden saw a direct, catastrophic link between the private sexual deviations of the Kaiser's inner circle and the diplomatic paralysis of the German state. In his mind, an unmanly private life inevitably produced an unmanly foreign policy. Harden did not unleash his arsenal all at once. He was a master of psychological warfare and media manipulation. In late 1906, he began a slow, deliberate campaign of coded exposure in the pages of Die Zukunft. He published blistering editorials criticizing the unhealthy and spiritualist influences surrounding the Kaiser. He utilized oblique references, mocking Eulenburg's poetry and his tendency to play the harp, contrasting these refined, effeminate pursuits with the martial duties required to run an empire. To the general public, these articles read as harsh but standard political critique. But to the elite of Berlin, and specifically to the men of the Liebenberg circle, the message was terrifyingly clear. Harden was signaling that he knew their secrets, and he was daring them to stop him. The initial reaction from Eulenburg and his network was a mixture of aristocratic disdain and quiet panic. They fell back on their traditional methods of defense. They assumed Harden was merely seeking a bribe or trying to extort political concessions. They tried to utilize their influence over the state apparatus to censor the publication, but Harden was too prominent and his readership too vast for the government to simply shut down Die Zukunft without triggering a massive public outcry about freedom of the press. Furthermore, the archaic aristocratic defense mechanism, the duel, was useless here. Harden was not a nobleman. To challenge him to a pistol duel would be to acknowledge his social equality, a concession the Junkers refused to make. They were effectively paralyzed, trapped in a modern media war they did not know how to fight, using the outdated tactics of a feudal society. Realizing the elite were too paralyzed to strike back, Harden escalated the conflict dramatically in the spring of 1907. He abandoned the coded language and went for the jugular. In a series of explosive articles, Harden explicitly named Philipp zu Eulenburg and his close associate, Count Kuno von Moltke, as the leaders of the Camarilla. He openly accused them of maintaining a Männerbund, a male-only bond that violated the moral and legal foundations of the state. He publicly declared that these men were unfit to advise the emperor, not merely because of their political views, but because their private lives made them susceptible to blackmail and inherently compromised their judgment. The publication of these articles sent a shockwave through the German Empire that was unprecedented in its scale and ferocity. This was not a minor scandal in a distant province. This was the most widely read intellectual in the nation, accusing the absolute highest echelons of the imperial government of severe criminal behavior. Newsstands across Berlin sold out within minutes. The articles were furiously debated in the Reichstag, discussed in the barracks, and whispered about in the royal courts across Europe. The invisible wall protecting Eulenburg had been shattered, and the private reality of the Liebenberg circle was dragged into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. But Harden did not stop at accusations of aristocratic exclusivity. He knew that to truly destroy Eulenburg, he had to break the illusion of elite solidarity and expose the raw, exploitative nature of the prince's actions. Utilizing the intelligence gathered from police leaks, Harden began to reference the specific transactional encounters Eulenburg had conducted far outside the castle walls. He brought the boatmen of Lake Starnberg and the milkmen of Munich into the narrative. He exposed the fact that the Kaiser's closest advisor had been systematically utilizing his wealth to purchase the bodies of the very working-class citizens the empire treated with such contempt. This revelation transformed the scandal from a matter of private immorality into a profound crisis of class and abuse of power. For the emerging socialist movements and the struggling working classes of Germany, the Harden-Eulenburg affair became the ultimate proof of the profound corruption and hypocrisy of the ruling elite. It demonstrated that the aristocracy, which demanded absolute moral compliance and military discipline from the lower classes, was privately engaging in illegal, exploitative behavior with total impunity. The public outrage was no longer just about paragraph 175. It was about a system of justice that seemingly applied only to the poor. As the media frenzy reached a fever pitch, the true, terrifying objective of Maximilian Harden's crusade became agonizingly apparent to the imperial court. Harden's ultimate target was never simply Philipp zu Eulenburg. It was the emperor himself. By inextricably linking Eulenburg's criminalized private life with his supreme influence over the throne, Harden forced the German public and the world to ask a highly dangerous question. Eulenburg and Wilhelm II had been inseparable for over 20 years. They spent months together in isolated hunting lodges, sharing an intimacy that excluded even the Kaiser's wife. If Eulenburg was the architect of a vast homosexual underground, the public reasoned, how could the Kaiser possibly be ignorant of it? The horrifying suspicion began to take root that Kaiser Wilhelm II, the supreme warlord, the grandson of Queen Victoria, the physical embodiment of the German state, was either a willing participant in the Liebenberg Camarilla's activities, or he was so hopelessly naive and easily manipulated that he was entirely unfit to rule. The scandal struck at the very heart of the monarchy's legitimacy. The divine right of kings, the bedrock of the Hohenzollern dynasty, was being dragged through the mud of tabloid journalism. The prestige of the crown, upon which the entire fragile architecture of the unified German Empire rested, was cracking under the immense pressure of public suspicion. Faced with the very real possibility of his own ruin, Kaiser Wilhelm II reacted with the brutal, self-preserving instinct of a cornered monarch. For 2 decades, Eulenburg had been his emotional anchor, his closest friend, and the architect of his government. But the moment the scandal threatened to engulf the throne, the Kaiser's loyalty evaporated instantly. Driven by a desperate need to distance himself from the toxic fallout, Wilhelm demanded that Eulenburg and Moltke either explicitly clear their names through the courts or face total excommunication from the court and the military. The emperor, who had relied on Eulenburg's soothing presence for his entire adult life, coldly and permanently severed all ties. Wilhelm's betrayal was absolute. He stripped the members of the Camarilla of their court access and military commissions, effectively throwing them to the wolves of the press and the judiciary to save his own reputation. Eulenburg, who had dedicated his life to protecting the Kaiser's psychological stability and political standing, found himself suddenly isolated, abandoned by his sovereign, and facing the full, terrifying machinery of the German legal system. The Shadow Emperor had been dragged out of the dark, stripped of his imperial shield, and left to face the consequences of a double life that the state could no longer afford to protect. The political bomb had detonated, and the subsequent battle for survival would require the German judicial system to engage in a cover-up so massive and corrupt that it would permanently scar the soul of the empire. The abandonment by Kaiser Wilhelm II left Philipp zu Eulenburg standing entirely exposed on a profoundly dangerous battlefield. For his entire adult life, he had operated behind the impenetrable shield of imperial favor. Without it, he was simply a citizen of the German Empire, albeit a wealthy and titled one, suddenly subjected to the brutal machinery of the very legal system he had spent decades manipulating from the shadows. The transition from untouchable confidant to criminal defendant was a dizzying descent, accelerated by a catastrophic miscalculation born of aristocratic pride and sheer desperation. In the rigid, honor-bound society of Prussian nobility, an accusation of cowardice or unmanly behavior could not simply be ignored or dismissed with a press release. The social code demanded a forceful public defense. Stripped of his military rank and banished from the court, Eulenburg was desperate to claw his way back into the Kaiser's good graces. He convinced himself that if he could legally obliterate Maximilian Harden and his newspaper, the emperor would welcome him back to Liebenberg. To achieve this, Eulenburg and his allies, most notably Count Kuno von Moltke, initiated a series of libel and defamation lawsuits against Harden and his publishers. This was precisely the trap Harden had spent months meticulously setting. By forcing the aristocrats to sue him for libel, Harden shifted the battleground from the court of public opinion to an actual court of law. In a libel trial, truth is the absolute defense. To prove he had not libeled Eulenburg and Moltke, Harden merely had to prove that his allegations regarding their violation of paragraph 175 were factually accurate. He was legally permitted, and indeed required, to produce evidence and call witnesses to testify under oath about the deepest, darkest secrets of the Liebenberg circle. The catastrophic turning point arrived when Philipp zu Eulenburg was called to testify. Cornered by the defense and desperate to salvage the remnants of his honor, Eulenburg made a fatal decision. Standing before a judge, he swore a solemn oath, an oath backed by his title, his aristocratic honor, and the legal weight of the empire, that he had never in his life engaged in homosexual acts, nor had he ever violated paragraph 175. It was a staggering, arrogant lie, uttered by a man who fundamentally believed that the word of a prince inherently outweighed the testimonies of commoners. He assumed that the rigid class hierarchy of Germany would prevent anyone from daring to contradict him in open court. He was disastrously wrong. Maximilian Harden's legal team immediately unleashed a devastating counteroffensive, producing the very men Eulenburg had spent years exploiting. When the testimonies of these working-class men directly contradicted the prince's sworn statement, the state prosecutor had no choice but to indict Philipp zu Eulenburg for perjury. The charge of perjury fundamentally altered the existential stakes of the scandal. Libel was a civil dispute. A violation of paragraph 175 was a criminal offense, but notoriously difficult to prove definitively without catching the participants in the act. Perjury, however, was a severe high-stakes felony against the integrity of the state itself. If Eulenburg was convicted of perjury, it would legally establish as historical fact that he was a homosexual who had lied to the courts to cover up his crimes. And if the Kaiser's absolute closest friend, the man who had effectively run the government for a decade, was legally branded a deviant and a perjurer, the credibility of the entire German monarchy would be fatally compromised. The imperial government in Berlin, driven by an acute sense of self-preservation, realized that a fair and transparent trial could not be permitted to occur. The state apparatus, which had previously remained paralyzed by the scandal, now awoke with terrifying efficiency. The objective was no longer to protect Eulenburg the individual, but to protect the institution of the monarchy from the collateral damage of his inevitable ruin. To do this, the government mobilized a massive, deeply corrupt campaign to suppress the truth, intimidate the witnesses, and fundamentally rig the judicial process. The primary targets of this state-sponsored cover-up were the men from the bottom of the social hierarchy whom Eulenburg had utilized for his private gratification. The government recognized that Hardin's entire case rested on the courage of these working-class individuals to stand in a Berlin courtroom and tell the truth about a prince. The Imperial secret police, working in tandem with aristocratic fixers and high-ranking judicial officials, immediately deployed a ruthless dual strategy to ensure these men never made it to the witness stand, or if they did, that their testimonies were completely devoid of credibility. The strategy began with the carrot, the deployment of massive financial bribery. Detectives and royal agents descended upon the rural villages of Bavaria and the working-class slums of Munich. They sought out the boatmen of Lake Starnberg, men like Jakob Ernst, a simple fisherman whom Eulenburg had patronized and paid off for years. Ernst was a crucial witness. He possessed direct, intimate knowledge of Eulenburg's activities and had a long, documented history of receiving the prince's money. Agents of the state approached men like Ernst with offers of staggering sums of cash, amounts that a fisherman could not earn in a lifetime of labor. In exchange, the men simply had to agree to sign affidavits, retracting their previous statements to Hardin's investigators, or better yet, take the money and immediately board trains for Switzerland or ships bound for America, disappearing until the trial was concluded. For many impoverished men, the influx of imperial hush money was an irresistible exit strategy from a terrifying situation. They took the cash and vanished, effectively neutralizing Hardin's witness list. But for those who hesitated, or those who felt a sense of moral obligation to tell the truth after years of exploitation, the state swiftly replaced the carrot with the stick. The intimidation tactics utilized by the Prussian authorities were brutal and psychologically devastating. Local police inspectors, operating under orders from Berlin, would visit the homes of potential witnesses in the dead of night. They explicitly outlined the terrifying consequences of crossing the imperial government. For the boatmen and day laborers, the threats were economic and physical. The sudden loss of fishing licenses, immediate eviction from their homes, or the sudden, violent attention of local thugs. The intimidation reached its most severe levels when applied to the military personnel involved in the scandal. The lower-ranking soldiers who had been drawn into Eulenburg's orbit were subjected to the absolute, crushing weight of military discipline. They were hauled before their commanding officers and subjected to aggressive interrogations. They were reminded that the army protected its own, and that testifying against the Kaiser's former confidant was an act of profound disloyalty to the uniform. They were threatened with immediate courts-martial, dishonorable discharges, and years in harsh military prisons if they dared to speak to the press or the civilian courts. The soldiers, trained to obey the chain of command above all else, were effectively trapped between the terrifying power of the imperial state and the relentless probing of Maximilian Hardin's investigators. When the perjury trials finally commenced in the imposing, sterile halls of the Moabit Criminal Court in Berlin, the atmosphere was thick with tension and systemic corruption. The courtroom became a brutal theater of class warfare. On one side stood Philipp zu Eulenburg, pale and visibly deteriorating, yet still cloaked in the immense privilege of his title, surrounded by the most expensive defense attorneys in the empire. On the other side stood a procession of simple boatmen, milk deliverymen, and terrified soldiers, men who had been dragged from their quiet lives into the glaring, hostile spotlight of international media. The judicial machinery operated with a clear, predetermined bias. The presiding judges and the state prosecutors, men whose careers depended entirely on the favor of the imperial establishment, actively facilitated the distortion of truth. When the working-class witnesses took the stand to recount their encounters with the prince, they were subjected to vicious, humiliating cross-examinations. The defense attorneys, implicitly aided by the judges, sought to portray these men not as victims of exploitation, but as opportunistic, predatory blackmailers. The strategy was to weaponize the witnesses' poverty against them. The lawyers relentlessly questioned the boatmen about the money they had received from Eulenburg, twisting the prince's hush money into evidence of a vast, lower-class extortion racket. If a fisherman stammered, or if his memory of an encounter from a decade prior was slightly inconsistent, the defense seized upon it as absolute proof of perjury. The court systematically stripped the working-class witnesses of their dignity and their legal legitimacy. The very system that had failed to protect them from the prince's predation was now punishing them for daring to expose it. Conversely, the testimonies of the aristocratic elite who rushed to Eulenburg's defense were treated with solemn reverence. Generals, counts, and high-ranking diplomats took the stand to swear to Eulenburg's unimpeachable character and traditional masculinity. Their lies and evasions were accepted into the official record without challenge. The courtroom became a grotesque mirror of Wilhelmine society, where the truth was not determined by factual evidence, but dictated entirely by the social rank of the person speaking. Yet, despite the massive bribes, the ruthless intimidation, and the blatant courtroom corruption, the state's cover-up began to fracture. Maximilian Harden was relentless. He continued to find new witnesses, digging deeper into the hidden corners of Eulenburg's past. The sheer volume of men coming forward, combined with the detailed overlapping nature of their accounts, made it impossible for the judges to completely dismiss the charges without inciting a public riot. The socialist press and the liberal factions in the Reichstag began to loudly denounce the trial as a state-sponsored sham, demanding a transparent accounting of the Camarilla's influence over the emperor. The trials dragged on through grueling months of appeals, retrials, and escalating public hysteria. The relentless pressure of the perjury charges, combined with the absolute abandonment by his beloved emperor, began to exact a catastrophic toll on Philipp zu Eulenburg. He was a man who had lived his entire life in a carefully controlled environment of wealth and deference. The violent exposure of his deepest secrets and the brutal reality of the criminal courts shattered him. He began to suffer from severe physical and psychological breakdowns. As Eulenburg's health rapidly deteriorated, the imperial government realized they were facing a terrifying stalemate. They could not secure a clean acquittal without exposing the corruption of the judiciary, but they absolutely could not allow a perjury conviction to tarnish the throne. The trials were a bleeding wound on the body of the empire, a daily reminder of the rot at the center of the state. The state apparatus needed a way to permanently silence the proceedings, an exit strategy that did not require a verdict. Realizing that the legal system could not contain the scandal, the architects of the cover-up turned to the only institution capable of overriding the courts. The imperial medical establishment. The German imperial state had reached a terrifying impasse. The machinery of the judiciary, designed to crush dissent and protect the aristocracy, was tearing itself apart in the Moabit criminal court. Every day that Philipp zu Eulenburg sat in the docket, the press unearthed another layer of the deep, transactional underworld that connected the highest echelons of the Kaiser's court to the grimiest docks of Bavaria. The government could not secure an acquittal without inciting a working-class revolt against the blatant corruption of the courts, and it could not allow a conviction without legally validating the devastating rumors surrounding the emperor. The political crisis required an exit strategy that completely circumvented the laws of truth and perjury. The solution was found not in jurisprudence, but in clinical medicine. In the early 20th century, the German medical establishment was revered worldwide. It was viewed as an institution of absolute, objective science. However, at its highest levels, the medical profession was deeply intertwined with the imperial state. The senior physicians of the Charité Hospital and the royal courts were men who owed their prestige, their titles, and their funding directly to the emperor. When the state needed a mechanism to permanently silence the Eulenburg trials without issuing a verdict, it activated this network of elite doctors. They were tasked with executing a clinical cover-up, weaponizing medical diagnosis to paralyze the legal system. It must be acknowledged that Eulenburg was genuinely suffering. The relentless stress of the scandal, the vicious public humiliation, and the absolute betrayal by Kaiser Wilhelm II had exacted a severe physical and psychological toll. He was a man in his 60s, accustomed to deference and luxury, suddenly subjected to grueling interrogations and the terrifying prospect of a prison cell. His health was failing. He suffered from legitimate nervous exhaustion and cardiovascular distress. But the state did not merely observe his decline. It cultivated, exaggerated, and legally weaponized it. The strategy required a grotesque public spectacle. To justify the suspension of the highest-profile criminal trial in German history, the public needed to see a broken man. In July 1908, the courtroom theater reached its bleakest act. Philipp zu Eulenburg, a prince of the empire and former architect of global diplomacy, was not permitted to walk into the courtroom. Instead, he was carried in on a hospital stretcher, pale, emaciated, and clutching a bottle of smelling salts. He was wheeled before the judge like a corpse awaiting a eulogy rather than a defendant awaiting a verdict. This visual was meticulously curated by his medical team. The doctors hovered around the stretcher, constantly checking his pulse, mopping his brow, and interrupting the prosecutors to declare that the defendant was too weak to comprehend the questions. Whenever a particularly damaging witness took the stand, a former soldier or a Starnberg boatman, Eulenburg would conveniently collapse. His eyes would roll back, his breathing would grow shallow, and the court physicians would dramatically intervene, administering stimulants and loudly proclaiming that the prince was on the verge of fatal heart failure. The presiding judges, who fully understood the political necessity of these interruptions, played their part flawlessly. They expressed grave concern for the defendant's welfare. The prosecutors, normally ruthless in their pursuit of perjury, suddenly became highly deferential to the medical authorities. The testimonies of the working-class victims were constantly interrupted, their momentum broken by the prince's carefully timed medical emergencies. The raw truth of exploitation was smothered under a blanket of clinical jargon and manufactured pity. Following a series of these courtroom collapses, the elite medical commission submitted their final, decisive report to the court. Heavily stamped with official seals and signed by the most decorated doctors in Berlin, the document swore under oath that Prince Philipp zu Eulenburg was suffering from severe, irreversible nervous collapse and a highly degraded cardiac condition. The medical certificate stated unequivocally that forcing him to endure further legal proceedings would result in his immediate death. The doctors essentially diagnosed him as medically unfit for the rigors of justice. Armed with these documents, the government executed its masterstroke. The court did not declare Eulenburg innocent. It did not declare him guilty. Invoking the medical certificates as an absolute, unquestionable authority, the judge suspended the perjury trial sine die indefinitely. The legal proceedings were frozen in time. The state had successfully used the objective veil of medical science to whitewash a massive criminal conspiracy. Maximilian Harden was robbed of his ultimate legal victory. The working-class witnesses were dismissed, their testimonies left hanging in a void of unresolved litigation, and the Kaiser's reputation was insulated from the immediate threat of a guilty verdict from his closest friend. The immediate crisis was averted, but the cost to Eulenburg was absolute annihilation. He was not sent to prison, but his punishment was far more profound. With the trial indefinitely suspended, he was stripped of his diplomatic passports, his military honors, and his access to the imperial court. He was ordered to return to Schloss Liebenberg and remain there. It was a sentence of unofficial, permanent house arrest. The shadow capital of the German Empire was instantly transformed into a high-security quarantine zone for a political pariah. The return to Liebenberg marked the beginning of a brutal, protracted psychological death. For 2 decades, the estate had been the vibrant center of European power. Its halls had echoed with the laughter of generals, the music of composers, and the confident voice of the emperor. Now it was a silent tomb. The vast hunting grounds were empty. The grand dining room, which once hosted the architects of the empire, was deserted. The massive staff of servants moved through the corridors with hushed urgency, treating the master of the house not as a sovereign, but as a terminal patient. The silence of Liebenberg was broken only by the deafening absence of one man, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The emperor's erasure of Eulenburg was total and absolute. There were no secret letters of condolence, no discreet visits, no acknowledgement that the man who had stabilized his volatile mind for 20 years still existed. Wilhelm, terrified that any lingering association with the Camarilla would reignite the scandal, cut the cord with a ruthlessness that defied human loyalty. Eulenburg was left to rot in his castle, forced to realize that the deep, intimate friendship he had valued above all else was, to the Kaiser, entirely disposable the moment it became politically inconvenient. This isolation forced Eulenburg into a terrible confrontation with the contradictions of his own life. He had built his existence on the premise of aristocratic untouchability. He had believed that his immense wealth and his proximity to the crown exempted him from the moral and legal constraints of ordinary men. He had used the bodies of the poor as temporary escapes, treating them as disposable commodities. Now, he himself was the disposable commodity, discarded by the very system he had helped govern. The men he had exploited on Lake Starnberg had returned to their boats, impoverished but free. Eulenburg, with all his titles and his millions, was trapped within a gilded cage from which he would never escape. Confined to his bedchamber or a wheelchair on the terraces, Eulenburg spent his remaining years reading the newspapers that had destroyed him. He became a ghost watching the world move on without him. And what he watched was the systematic dismantling of his life's work. With the Liebenberg Camarilla destroyed, the moderating influence on the Kaiser was gone. Wilhelm II, stripped of the men who had cautioned against aggression, fell entirely under the sway of the hawkish military establishment. The generals and the admirals, who had despised Eulenburg's diplomatic caution, now had unfettered access to the emperor's ear. From his enforced exile, Eulenburg watched as Germany engaged in an increasingly aggressive, militaristic foreign policy. He watched the naval arms race escalate. He watched the delicate web of European diplomacy, which he had spent years maintaining, unravel into hostile, inflexible alliances. The bitter, agonizing irony of his confinement was the realization that his personal downfall had directly paved the way for the geopolitical catastrophe he had dedicated his career to preventing. Many historians argue that the destruction of his moderating influence removed the final civilian barrier, allowing the hawkish military establishment to pull the continent toward the abyss. He lingered in this state of living death for 13 years. The trial remained technically open, a sword of Damocles hanging over his head, ensuring he could never speak publicly or attempt to clear his name without facing immediate rearrest. He survived long enough to witness the ultimate consequences of his absence from the emperor's side. He survived to see the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. He survived to see the millions of young men, the same class of men he had once exploited in the shadows, marched into the mechanized slaughter of the trenches. He survived to see the collapse of the Imperial German army, the revolution in the streets of Berlin, and the humiliating abdication and exile of Wilhelm II in 1918. Philipp zu Eulenburg died at Schloss Liebenberg in 1921. at the age of 74. He died not as a statesman or a prince, but as a broken relic of a destroyed empire. The man who had once held the fate of millions in his hands drew his last breath in total political obscurity, his legacy forever defined by the very scandal the state had tried so desperately to bury. His life stands as a brutal testament to the fragility of human power, illustrating how the most terrifying vulnerabilities of an empire are often not found on the battlefield, but hidden within the secret, devastating compulsions of the men who rule it. The collapse of the Eulenburg Circle functioned as a national autopsy, exposing the terminal contradictions of the German Empire. The Social Democratic Party immediately weaponized the scandal. They transformed the bribed boatmen and soldiers into devastating proof of class warfare, exposing a system that exploited the working class while shielding aristocratic crimes. Concurrently, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld's attempt to scientifically defend Eulenburg backfired catastrophically. It cemented a toxic public narrative that equated homosexuality with elite decadence and political treason, setting the German gay rights movement back by decades. The deadliest legacy of the affair, however, was the resulting power vacuum. Stripped of Eulenburg's moderating influence, Kaiser Wilhelm II was left entirely exposed to the hardline military establishment. To survive in a paranoid political climate where diplomatic compromise was equated with unmanly weakness, German leadership adopted a posture of extreme, aggressive brinkmanship. In the summer of 1914, when the diplomatic machinery failed, there was no Eulenburg to walk the Kaiser back from the precipice. The empire plunged into the First World War. Under permanent house arrest at Eulenburg, Eulenburg survived just long enough to witness the industrial slaughter of the very working-class men he had once exploited, followed by the total collapse of the Hohenzollern dynasty. He died in political obscurity in 1921. The Eulenburg affair leaves a brutal systemic lesson. An empire's most fatal vulnerabilities are rarely forged on the battlefield, but are hidden within the unchecked, private compulsions of its rulers.